When Clint Eastwood's personal chef of 22 years threw his white coat in the passenger seat of his truck and drove away, 3 hours before the biggest dinner of the year, nobody knew what to do. 22 guests were coming. The lamb wasn't seasoned. The risotto wasn't started. The kitchen staff stood frozen, and the man who had never missed a single meal in 2 decades was gone. Just like that. No warning, no explanation. Just a slammed door and the sound of gravel under tires. Now, most people would expect a 96-year-old Hollywood legend to pick up the phone. Call a restaurant, call a caterer, get angry, fire someone. But Clint Eastwood didn't do any of that. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, took off his flannel shirt, reached for a clean apron, and tied it around his waist. Then he looked at the staff and said 5 words that nobody expected. "We do this ourselves." And what happened over the next 8 hours would become a story that every single person at that dinner table would carry for the rest of their lives. Because this wasn't just about cooking. This wasn't about a famous man saving a dinner party. This was about a secret. A secret Clint had been carrying alone for 17 days. A secret about his chef's daughter. A secret so heavy that when the truth finally came out, at midnight, in front of 22 guests, through a white envelope left on an empty chair, grown men broke down crying at the table. But here's the part that will hit you the hardest. There was a reason Clint was so calm when his chef walked out. There was a reason he wasn't surprised. There was a reason he had set 23 chairs at a table meant for 22. And there was a reason he had placed that envelope on the empty seat, with no plate, no glass, and no silverware. He knew this was coming. He had been preparing for this moment. And what was inside that envelope would change his chef's life forever. But I can't tell you what it is yet. Not here, not now, because this story needs to be felt from the beginning. You need to know who this chef was, where he came from, what he gave up, what he built, and what was about to be taken from him, before you can understand what Clint Eastwood did about it. So stay with me. Watch this whole video, because by the end, you will understand why a plate of food can mean more than 1,000,000 words, and you will never look at Clint Eastwood the same way again. This is that story. The kitchen door slammed so hard that the pots on the wall shook. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Saturday in late October. The sun hung low over the hills of Carmel by the sea, painting the sky in shades of gold and rust. In less than 3 hours, 22 of the most important people in Clint Eastwood's life would arrive at his home for a dinner he had spent 6 weeks planning. And his chef had just quit. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now. Tobiah Marin Vasquez, a man who had cooked every meal in this house for over 2 decades, stood in the gravel driveway with his white chef's coat balled up in his fist. His eyes were red, his hands were shaking. He didn't look angry, he looked broken. "I can't do this tonight," Tobiah said, his voice cracked like dry wood. "I'm sorry, Mr. Eastwood, I can't." Inside the kitchen, the staff froze. Fenwick Harlow, the sous chef, stood holding a tray of hand-cut pasta with his mouth hanging open. Waverly Odom, the kitchen assistant, gripped a bundle of fresh rosemary so tight that the green oils stained her fingers. Sable Greer, Clint's house manager, pressed her clipboard against her chest like a shield. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, because nobody had ever seen Tobiah Vasquez walk away from anything. This was a man who once cooked a 7-course meal with a broken wrist. A man who drove through a wildfire evacuation zone to get back to the kitchen because Clint had guests coming. A man who missed his own mother's birthday 4 years in a row because the work always came first. And now he was leaving. Sable was the first to speak. She stepped out onto the porch. Her heels clicked on the wooden boards. "Tobiah, wait. Whatever it is, we can work it out. The guests arrive at 7:30. We have the lamb, the risotto, I know what we have," Tobiah snapped. Then he caught himself. He pressed a hand over his eyes. I'm sorry, Sable. I know what tonight means, but I have to go." "Go where?" Sable asked. Tobiah didn't answer. He just turned toward his old truck parked under the oak tree. He opened the door, threw his chef's coat on the passenger seat, started the engine. Gravel crunched under the tires as he pulled away. The kitchen was still frozen. 22 guests. 7:30 sharp. No chef. Fenwick looked at Waverly. Waverly looked at Sable. Sable looked down at her clipboard, then up at the hallway that led to the study. That's where Clint was. Now, here is what most people would expect from a 96-year-old Hollywood legend in this moment. Anger, panic, a phone call to some expensive restaurant in Monterey begging them to send a replacement. Maybe a sharp word about loyalty. Maybe a cold silence that meant somebody was getting fired. But Clint Eastwood did none of those things. What he did instead would become a story that every person at that dinner table would carry for the rest of their lives. A story that would make grown men cry. A story that would change how the world saw this quiet, towering man. But that part comes later. Because first, you need to understand something. Something that nobody in that kitchen knew yet. Something that Clint Eastwood had been carrying alone for 17 days. A secret. And that secret had everything to do with why there was an empty chair at the head of the dinner table. A chair with no plate, no glass, no silverware. Just a single white envelope resting on the seat. Nobody knew what was in that envelope. Not Sable, not Fennec, not even Tobiah. Only Clint knew. And he wasn't telling, not yet. What made Tobiah, the most loyal man alive, walk out of that kitchen? What is Clint hiding? And what is inside that envelope? The answers are coming, but not until you're ready. Sable walked down the long hallway toward Clint's study. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. The walls on either side were lined with framed photographs, movie posters, award ceremonies, candid shots from film sets around the world. But the photo that always caught Sable's eye was the small one near the study door. It showed a much younger Clint standing in a tiny restaurant kitchen next to a young man with dark curly hair and a shy smile. The young man held a wooden spoon like it was a sword. Clint had his arm around the young man's shoulders. That young man was Tobiah, 22 years ago. Sable knocked on the study door. "Come in," Clint said. She opened the door. Clint sat in his leather chair by the window. He was reading a book. His reading glasses sat on the end of his nose. A glass of water rested on the table beside him. The room smelled like old paper and cedar wood. He looked calm, completely, impossibly calm. "Tobiah left," Sable said. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it wobbled at the edges. Clint looked up from his book. He didn't blink. He didn't frown. He just looked at her. Quiet, still, like a man watching rain through a window. "I know," he said. "You know? I heard the door." Sable waited for more. For instructions. For anger. For something. But Clint just closed his book. He took off his glasses. He set them on the table next to his water. Nothing else. Just silence. "The guests arrive in less than 3 hours," Sable said. Her voice was rising now. She couldn't help it. "We have 22 people coming. The lamb is prepped but not seasoned. The risotto base isn't started. The dessert needs assembly. Fennec is good, but he can't run this alone. And Waverly is only Sable." She stopped. One word. That was all it took. Not shouted, not harsh. Just her name. Spoken in that low, even voice that had commanded attention in 100 movies. The same voice that had whispered to frightened horses on screen and stared down outlaws in the desert. Clint stood up. He was tall, even now. Age had bent him slightly at the shoulders, but his eyes were sharp as river stones. He buttoned his flannel shirt at the cuffs, slowly, carefully, like a man getting ready for something important. "How long have you worked for me?" he asked. 11 years, she said. "In 11 years, have I ever let a dinner fall apart?" She thought about it. She thought about hurricanes, power outages, last-minute guest changes, a kitchen fire 3 years ago that nearly took out the whole east wall. Not once had the meal failed. Not once had Clint panicked. "No," she said. "Then why would tonight be different?" He walked past her. Down the hallway, past the photographs, past the memories, past the picture of a young man with a wooden spoon and a shy smile. Into the kitchen. When he stepped through the kitchen door, Fennec nearly dropped his pasta tray. Waverly set down the rosemary. Everyone stared. Clint Eastwood looked around the kitchen. He looked at the marble counters covered in ingredients. He looked at the industrial stove with its 8 burners, all cold. He looked at the clock on the wall. 5:02 p.m., 2 hours and 28 minutes until guests arrived. Then he did something that nobody, not one single person in that room, expected. He took off his flannel shirt. He hung it on the hook by the pantry door. He reached for a clean white apron folded on the shelf. He tied it around his waist. "All right," he said. "Fennec, where's the lamb?" Fennec pointed toward the walk-in refrigerator. His mouth still hung open. "Good. Waverly, I need garlic. Fresh. 3 heads. And the good olive oil. Not the cooking stuff. The one from that little place in Lucca." Waverly nodded. She moved fast. "Sable," Clint said. She stood in the doorway, her clipboard trembling in her hands. "Yes? Call nobody. Order nothing. We do this here. We do this ourselves." "But Clint, we do this ourselves." There was something in his voice that left no room for argument. Not anger, not pride. Something deeper, something that sounded almost like purpose. Like this moment, this exact moment, was something he had been waiting for. Like this was exactly what was supposed to happen. And standing in that doorway, watching a 96-year-old legend tie on an apron and take command of a kitchen, Sable Greer felt a chill run down both her arms. Not from the cold, from the feeling that something was happening in this house tonight that went far, far beyond dinner. Something she didn't understand yet. Something none of them did. He knew Tobiah was leaving before it happened. He's calm when he should be furious. And now he's cooking, like he's been planning for this all along. What does Clint Eastwood know that nobody else does? Here's what people didn't know about Clint Eastwood. They knew about the movies. They knew about the awards. They knew he directed and acted and produced, and that he was one of the most famous men in America for more than 60 years. But most people didn't know that he could cook. Not just scramble eggs on a Sunday cook. Really cook. The kind of cooking that comes from decades of watching, tasting, paying attention. The kind that comes from sitting in kitchens all over the world. Rome, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, a tiny village in southern France, and asking quiet questions while everyone else at the table just ate. Clint had learned to cook the way he learned everything, quietly, without fuss, by watching people who were good at it and then trying it himself when nobody was looking. And Tobiah had taught him more than anyone. Late nights after long film shoots, when Clint would wander into the kitchen at midnight, still wound up from a full day of directing, Tobiah would be there, always there, prepping for the next day, humming some old song his mother used to sing, and Clint would pull up a stool, rest his elbows on the counter, and say, "Show me that thing you did with the sauce." So Tobiah would show him, slowly, patiently. The way his mother Rosalita had shown him back in Oaxaca, standing on a wooden crate beside her in the market square, and Clint would watch, and he would remember. So when Clint Eastwood tied on that apron and rolled up his sleeves at 5:02 p.m. on a Saturday evening, his hands knew what to do. Maybe not as fast as Tobiah's, maybe not as graceful, but they knew. He started with the lamb. He pulled the rack from the walk-in refrigerator and laid it on the wooden cutting board. He pressed his thumb into the meat to check the temperature. Cool. Good. Not too cold. Then he reached for the jar of dried herbs on the shelf. Rosemary, thyme, a pinch of smoked paprika, and began mixing them in a small bowl with coarse salt and cracked black pepper. He added a splash of the good olive oil from Lucca. He crushed a clove of garlic with the flat side of a knife and stirred it in. "Fennec," he said without looking up, "start the risotto base. Shallots first. Low heat. Don't rush it." "Yes, sir." Fennec moved to the stove. His hands were still shaking a little, but they moved. "Waverly, those garlic heads. Roast them whole. Cut the tops off. Drizzle the oil. Wrap them tight in foil. 400 degrees. 35 minutes. Not a minute more." "Got it," Waverly said. She was already reaching for the foil. The kitchen came alive. Slowly at first, like an old engine that had stalled and was now turning over. Then faster. The sound of knives on cutting boards. The hiss of butter melting in a hot pan. The low rumble of the oven coming up to temperature. The pop of a shallot hitting warm oil. Clint worked at the center island. His movements were careful, deliberate. He rubbed the herb mixture into the lamb with both hands, pressing it deep into every curve and fold. His fingers were strong despite their age. Steady despite the years. There was a tenderness in his hands, a kind of love that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with respect. Respect for the food, respect for the people who would eat it, respect for the man who had taught him how to do this. Sable stood in the doorway watching. She had managed this household for 11 years. She had seen Clint handle crises on film sets. She had seen him handle difficult people. She had seen him handle loss and grief and public criticism with a grace that made other men look small. But she had never seen him cook. And it wasn't just that he was doing it. It was how he was doing it. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't stressed. He wasn't barking orders or checking the clock every 30 seconds. He looked like a man doing exactly what he was meant to do in exactly this moment. "Clint," she said softly. He looked up. A streak of olive oil glistened on his forearm. "Do you know why he left?" Clint held her gaze for a long moment. His eyes didn't move. His face didn't change. But something shifted behind those eyes. Something heavy. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to tell me?" He looked back down at the lamb. He pressed another handful of herbs into the crust. "Not yet." 2 words, "not yet." And the way he said them, gentle but firm, like a door closing softly, told Sable that pushing further would be pointless. She looked through the open doorway into the dining room. The long table was already set. 22 place settings gleamed under the chandelier, crystal glasses. Linen napkins folded into neat rectangles. Candles waiting to be lit. But something was wrong with the table. There were 23 chairs, 22 guests, 23 chairs, 1 extra. At the head of the table, closest to the kitchen door, and on that chair sat a white envelope. "Clint," Sable said. "There's an extra chair." "No, there isn't," he said. "But there's no plate on it, no glass, just an, I know what's there, Sable." His voice was soft now, almost tender. "Leave it be." She looked at the envelope. She looked at Clint. She looked at the clock. 5:31 p.m. Something was going on in this house. Something bigger than a chef walking out before dinner. Something that Clint had planned. Something that involved that envelope, that empty chair, and whatever secret he'd been keeping for 17 long days. But he wasn't ready to share it. Not yet. So Sable did what she had always done for 11 years. She trusted him. She picked up her clipboard. She straightened her back, and she went to check on the flowers. Clint knows why Tobiah left. He won't say. There are 23 chairs for 22 guests, and a white envelope sits on a seat with no plate. What is Clint Eastwood hiding? The answer is closer than you think, but it's not time yet. To understand what happened that night, you need to know about Tobiah Marin Vasquez. Not the chef, not the man in the white coat who cooked perfect lamb and stirred risotto with his eyes closed. You need to know the man before all of that. The boy, the son, the story that started long before Clint Eastwood's kitchen. Tobiah was born in a small town outside Oaxaca, Mexico. The town didn't have a name that most people would recognize. It had dirt roads and painted walls and dogs that slept in the shade of mango trees. It had a church with a cracked bell that still rang every Sunday morning. And it had a market square. That's where his mother worked. Rosalita Vasquez ran a food stand between the flower seller and the woman who sold hand-woven blankets. She cooked over an open fire, a clay stove that she had built herself with bricks she carried from the river. She sold tamales wrapped in banana leaves and a black mole sauce that people drove hours to taste. The smoke followed her everywhere, to the market, to the church, to bed at night. Even on Sundays, when she wore her best white dress and sat in the front pew, she smelled like toasted chili and dark chocolate and the kind of warmth that makes strangers feel like family. Tobiah was her only son. His father left before Tobiah could walk. Rosalita never spoke about him, not with anger, not with sadness. She simply raised her boy alone and poured everything she had into 2 things, her food and her child. Tobiah grew up standing on a wooden crate beside her at the market. He was too short to reach the stove, so Rosalita built him a little platform out of old fruit boxes. He stirred pots that were bigger than he was. He crushed spices with a stone pestle that weighed more than his arm. By the time he was 10 years old, he could make her mole from memory. All 31 ingredients, measured not by cups or spoons, but by hand and heart. Cooking is not about the food, Rosalita used to tell him. She said it every single day, like a prayer. Cooking is about the person you are feeding. You must think of them. You must feel what they need. If you forget that, you are just making noise in the kitchen. Tobiah never forgot. When he was 17, he made a decision that would change everything. He told his mother he was going north, to California, to find work, to build a life that was bigger than the market square. Rosalita cried. She packed him a bag with clean clothes, a small wooden cross, and a glass jar filled with her dried chili paste, the same paste that made her mole sauce famous for 100 miles. "Take this," she said, pressing the jar into his hands. "When you taste it, you will remember where you come from, and you will never be lost." Tobiah crossed the border with nothing else. No money, no papers, no plan. Just a backpack, a jar of chili paste, and the memory of his mother's voice saying, "Think of the person you are feeding." He worked in restaurant kitchens all over Southern California. Washing dishes, peeling vegetables, mopping floors at 2 in the morning when his back ached so bad he could barely stand. He slept in storage rooms, on bags of rice, under tables pushed against walls. He sent every extra dollar home to Rosalita. Nobody saw him. Nobody knew his name. He was just another pair of hands in a hot kitchen, invisible to the people eating in the dining room on the other side of the wall. But he kept cooking, every chance he got. When the line cooks went on break, Tobiah would slide over to the stove and practice. Sauces, stocks. The way heat changes garlic from sharp to sweet, if you slice it thin and cook it slow. He learned Italian food, French food, Japanese food. He learned them all. But underneath every dish, there was always his mother's voice, always her lesson. Think of the person you are feeding. By 25, he had worked his way up to line cook at a small Italian restaurant in Carmel by the Sea. It was a quiet place, white tablecloths, candles in wine bottles, a garden out back where the chef grew basil and tomatoes. That's where Clint Eastwood found him. But that story, the pasta, the lemon, the night that changed both their lives, you already know a piece of it. What you don't know yet is what happened 22 years later. What happened to the daughter he raised in the cottage behind Clint's house. The girl he named after light itself, Paloma Luz Vasquez. She was 19 years old, sharp as a blade, brave as a river, beautiful in a way that reminded everyone of Rosalita. The same dark eyes, the same quiet strength, the same hands that moved like they already knew what to do. She was studying medicine at a university in San Francisco. She wanted to be a doctor. Not a rich doctor with a fancy office. She wanted to go back to Oaxaca someday and open a clinic for the people who had nothing, for the mothers who cooked over clay stoves, for the children who stood on wooden crates, for the ones nobody saw. Tobiah talked about her all the time, not in a bragging way, in a soft, amazed way, like he still couldn't believe that a man who once slept on a bag of rice in a storage room could have a daughter studying to save lives. "She is my best recipe," he would say, and everyone who heard it would smile, because they knew he meant it more than anything he had ever said in his life. But 3 weeks before the dinner party, something happened to Paloma. Something terrible. Something that would explain everything. Why Tobiah's hands were shaking. Why his eyes were red. Why the strongest man anyone had ever known walked out of that kitchen like a man walking into the sea. Something that Clint Eastwood already knew about. Something he had been quietly, secretly, working to fix for 17 days. But you're not ready to hear that yet. Not because it's too hard, but because you need to feel what Tobiah felt first. You need to understand the weight of it. The fear, the helplessness, the way a father's heart can break so quietly that the whole world keeps spinning and nobody even notices. That part of the story is coming. It's close now. For now, all you need to know is this. Tobiah didn't leave that kitchen because he stopped caring. He left because he cared too much. About everything. About the dinner, about Clint, about the life he had built in this house with his own 2 hands over 22 long years. And most of all, about the one thing in his life that he could not fix with those hands, his daughter. His Paloma, his light, a boy who crossed a border with nothing, a mother who taught him that food is love, a daughter who became his reason for breathing. And now that daughter is in trouble, the kind of trouble that money can solve, but Tobiah doesn't have the money. Someone else does, and that someone has been working in silence for 17 days. At 7:15 p.m., the first headlights appeared at the bottom of the long gravel road. The sun was gone. The hills around the property had turned into dark shapes pressed against a deep purple sky. Lanterns lined the driveway in a straight row, casting soft circles of warm light on the stone path that led to the front door. Crickets sang in the tall grass. The air smelled like salt and eucalyptus and roasting meat. Inside the kitchen, the world was heat and steam and motion. Clint stood at the stove, stirring the risotto with a long wooden spoon. He had been cooking for over 2 hours straight. His face was flushed red from the heat. A thin line of sweat ran along his temple and disappeared into his collar. But his hand was steady. His eyes were locked on the pot. He stirred in slow, even circles, the way Tobiah had shown him. Never too fast, never too rough. Let the rice tell you when it's ready. Fennec worked beside him at the counter, slicing sourdough bread into thick pieces and laying them in a linen-lined basket. His hands had stopped shaking an hour ago. Something about watching Clint cook, so calm, so sure, had settled his nerves like a hand pressed flat on still water. Waverly was plating the appetizers, small rounds of toasted crostini topped with fresh ricotta, a drizzle of golden honey, and tiny leaves of thyme picked one by one from the stems. She placed each one on the tray with the focus of a painter finishing a canvas. They had done it. Somehow, against every reason and every odd, the three of them had done it. Sable appeared at the kitchen door. She had changed into a dark blue suit with a silver pin on the collar. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her clipboard was nowhere in sight. She looked like a woman who had made peace with whatever was about to happen. "First car is coming up the drive," she said. "It's Darnell." Clint nodded without looking up. "Let him in. Pour him a bourbon. The good one. Top shelf." Darnell Whitaker was Clint's oldest friend outside of Hollywood. They had met over 50 years ago at a cattle ranch in Montana. Darnell had been a horse trainer back then, wiry, sunburned, with a laugh that could scare birds out of trees. Now he was 81 years old, retired, and living in a cabin near Big Sur, with 2 dogs and a radio that only picked up one station. He came to every one of Clint's dinners. He always arrived first, and he always brought the same thing, a bottle of red wine from a tiny vineyard in the hills that only he seemed to know about. More headlights followed. One after another, they climbed the gravel road like slow-moving stars. Margot Elliston arrived with her husband, Piers. She was an art dealer from San Francisco who had known Clint for 30 years and never once called him by his last name. She wore a green silk scarf and earrings that caught the lantern light like sparks. Then came Kester Obi, a retired jazz musician who lived down the coast in a house filled with instruments he no longer played but refused to sell. He walked slowly with a cane made of dark wood, and he smiled at everyone like he knew a joke they hadn't heard yet. Then Lenora Vance, 87 years old, retired schoolteacher, the kind of woman who had taught half the children in Carmel how to read and the other half how to sit still. She wore a lavender dress and carried a small plate of cookies wrapped in foil because she never went anywhere without bringing something. One by one, the guests came in. They handed their coats to Sable. They smiled, they hugged. They wandered into the living room where a fire crackled in the big stone hearth, and soft music drifted from the speakers. Something old and warm. Piano. Maybe Chet Baker. Maybe someone nobody remembered anymore. Nobody knew what had happened in the kitchen 3 hours ago. Nobody knew that the chef had quit. Nobody knew that Clint Eastwood, 96 years old, an American legend, a man whose face was carved into the memory of the whole world, was standing over a hot stove in a flour-dusted apron, sweating over risotto. At 7:28 p.m., Sable stepped into the kitchen one last time. "Everyone's here," she said. "All 22. Clint didn't look up from the stove. "Good. They're asking about dinner. Should I say 30 minutes? Tell them to enjoy their drinks. Dinner comes when it's ready, not before." Sable paused. She opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she opened it again. "Clint, are you sure you don't want me to call someone? A caterer? A restaurant? Anything?" He looked up at her, just his eyes. The rest of his body stayed perfectly still. "I'm sure." She left. Fennec glanced over at Clint. He wiped his hands on his apron. "Mr. Eastwood, I just want you to know, you're doing amazing. That lamb smells unbelievable." Clint almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched, but it didn't quite get there. "Tobiah taught me that rub," he said. "20 years ago, I watched him do it 100 times. Never thought I'd use it without him standing next to me." The kitchen went quiet for a moment. Just the bubbling of the risotto, the soft crackle of the oven, the distant sound of laughter from the living room, where 22 people had no idea what was really happening tonight. "Is he okay?" Fennec asked. "Tobiah, I mean. Is he going to be all right?" Clint's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough for someone standing 3 feet away to notice. "He will be," Clint said. And that was all. In the dining room, the long table waited. Candles glowed. Crystal caught the light like trapped stars. 22 place settings shone under the warm chandelier. And at the head of the table, closest to the kitchen door, sat the 23rd chair. Empty. No plate, no glass, no napkin. Just that white envelope, resting on the seat like a quiet promise that nobody could read yet. Several guests noticed it as they passed on the way to their seats. Margot tilted her head and squinted. Darnell raised one bushy eyebrow. Lenora Vance touched her chest with both hands and whispered, "Oh my," but nobody asked about it. Because in Clint Eastwood's house, you learned early that everything had a reason. Even the things you didn't understand, especially those. 22 guests, a table full of candles, and a chair that waits for someone who doesn't know it's there. The dinner is about to begin, but the real story hasn't started yet. At 8:05 p.m., the kitchen doors swung open. The dining room went quiet. 22 faces turned toward the sound. Forks paused over bread plates. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. The soft piano music from the speakers suddenly seemed very far away, because it was not a waiter who walked through those doors. It was not Fennec carrying a silver tray. It was not Waverly balancing plates along her arms the way she always did, fast and careful as a dancer. It was Clint Eastwood. He carried a large wooden cutting board in both hands. On it sat the rack of lamb, golden-crusted, perfectly rested, ringed with sprigs of fresh rosemary and clusters of roasted garlic cloves split open like tiny flowers. The aroma reached the table before he did. It moved through the room like a warm hand pressing against every chest. Clint set the board down in the center of the table. He straightened up. He still wore the apron. There was flour on his forearm. A thin red burn mark ran across the pad of his right thumb. A small splatter of olive oil stained the collar of his undershirt. He looked at his guests. "Evening," he said, like nothing unusual was happening, like this was any other Saturday. Darnell Whitaker leaned forward in his chair. His eyes were wide. His bourbon sat forgotten in his hand. "Clint," he said slowly. "Did you cook this?" "I did." The room erupted. Not with applause, with noise. The warm, overlapping, breathless noise of 22 people, all trying to talk at the same time. Chairs scraped. Hands flew up. Voices climbed over each other like vines. "Where's Tobiah? Are you serious right now?" "Clint, since when can you cook? What on earth happened? Is that rosemary? Did he actually roast garlic?" Clint held up one hand, palm out, steady. The room went quiet, just like that, because he had that effect on people. He always had. One hand up and the whole world held its breath. "Tobiah had something he needed to take care of tonight," Clint said. His voice was calm and even, smooth as a lake at dawn. "So I took care of dinner. If that's all right with everyone." Darnell leaned back. He let out a laugh, a deep, booming laugh that rattled the candle flames and made the crystal glasses hum. "All right with us? Clint Eastwood cooked me dinner. This is the single greatest night of my entire life." The table laughed. The tension cracked open like an egg, and something warm spilled out. Glasses were raised. Forks were picked up. The night moved forward. But not everyone laughed. Margot Elliston watched Clint's face with sharp, careful eyes. She had known this man for 30 years. She had sat across from him at dozens of dinners, charity events, gallery openings. She could read him the way most people read a book. She knew when he was performing and when he was real. Right now, she saw both. The easy charm was a performance. The little joke about taking care of dinner, the casual evening when he walked through the door, that was the Clint the world saw. The movie star, the man who always had the right line at the right time. But underneath it was something heavier. Something that didn't match the smile, a weight behind his eyes that he was carrying with both hands, the same way he had carried that cutting board. She leaned toward Darnell and whispered, "Something's wrong." Darnell glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Look at his eyes." Darnell looked. Clint was carving the lamb now. He moved around the table, placing slices on each plate with steady hands. He told a story about the first time he tried to cook a steak and nearly set a trailer on fire during a film shoot in Nevada. People laughed. He smiled. But his eyes. Margot was right. Behind the warmth, behind the stories, there was a shadow, the kind of shadow that lives in a man who knows something painful, something he is holding alone, and has decided that tonight is not the night to let it show. Clint served every plate himself. He walked the full circle of the table, lamb beside risotto, roasted vegetables fanned out like a sunset, warm bread torn by hand. Fenwick and Waverly followed behind, filling glasses with wine and water. "This risotto," Lenora Vance said after her first bite. She closed her eyes. She pressed her hand flat against her heart and held it there like she was making a promise. "Oh, Clint, this is just beautiful." "Secrets in the stock," Clint said. "Homemade, Tobiah's recipe." There it was again, Tobiah's name, dropped into the room like a stone into still water. And each time Clint said it, something crossed his face. Quick, almost invisible. A flicker behind the eyes that came and went like a match, struck in the wind. Pain, not anger, not frustration at a chef who walked out 3 hours before the biggest dinner of the year. Not the pride of a man proving he could do it alone. Just pain, clean and simple. The kind that comes from watching someone you love carry a burden too heavy for one person. And knowing all along, that you've already done something about it, but not being able to say so. Not yet. Not until the right moment. Because Clint Eastwood understood something that most people never learn. Timing isn't just important in movies. It's important in love, too. And tonight, the timing had to be perfect. He served every plate with his own hands. He smiled and told stories, and made them laugh. But Margot saw what nobody else did, the shadow behind his eyes. This dinner is not what it seems, and that empty chair is starting to feel like the loudest thing in the room. While 22 people ate lamb and risotto in a candlelit dining room in Carmel by the Sea, Tobiah Marin Vasquez sat alone in his truck in a hospital parking lot in San Francisco. The engine was off. The windows were fogged from his breathing. The streetlights cast a pale orange glow across his face, turning the shadows under his eyes into dark bruises. He hadn't moved in 40 minutes. He hadn't eaten since morning. His stomach was empty, but he couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything except the weight pressing down on his chest, like a stone slab laid flat across his ribs. In his right hand, he held his phone. The screen glowed in the dark cabin of the truck. On it was a text message from a number he didn't recognize. It had arrived at 4:45 p.m., 2 minutes before he walked out of Clint's kitchen. The message read, "Mr. Vasquez, this is the scheduling office at Pacific Bay Medical Center. We need to confirm the pre-operative consultation for Paloma L. Vasquez. Date, October 29th. Time, 7 a.m. Please reply to confirm." October 29th. 5 days from now. The surgery. Paloma's surgery. Tobias stared at the words until they blurred into shapes that didn't mean anything anymore. He read them again and again. Each time, they hit the same spot in his chest, the same bruise that hadn't healed in 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, his daughter had collapsed. She was in her apartment in San Francisco, studying for an exam. Her roommate heard a sound, not a scream, not a crash, just a soft thud like a book falling off a shelf, and found Paloma on the kitchen floor, eyes open, body still, breathing, but barely. The roommate called an ambulance. At the hospital, they ran tests, scans, blood work, hours of waiting in hallways that smelled like bleach and fear. And then the doctor, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands, sat Tobiah down in a small room with no windows and told him what they had found, a growth. In Paloma's brain, small, the size of a grape, sitting in a place that was hard to reach but impossible to ignore. "It's treatable," Dr. Kesslin Park had said. "We can remove it. The success rate for this procedure is very high, but it requires a specialized surgery, and it needs to happen soon." How soon? Tobiah asked. Within the month. How much? Dr. Park paused. She looked down at her clipboard. Then she looked back up at Tobiah with the careful expression of someone about to deliver a second blow. $387,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. Tobiah heard it. He understood it, but his body rejected it the way a body rejects poison. His hands went cold. His vision narrowed. He nodded politely. He held his daughter's hand. He said, "Thank you, doctor. We'll figure it out." Then he drove back to Carmel, parked behind his cottage, and cried for 2 hours with his forehead pressed against the steering wheel. He hadn't told anyone. Not Sable, not Fennec, not Clint. He couldn't. He was too proud, too afraid, too ashamed that after 22 years of work, good, honest, back-breaking work, he didn't have enough money to save his own daughter's life. He had called every bank he could find, every loan company, every charity. He had looked into selling his truck, selling his savings, selling his mother's gold ring, the one Rosalita had pressed into his palm the last time he saw her alive, whispering, "Keep this close. It carries my love." It wasn't enough. None of it was enough, not even close. So when that text message lit up his phone at 4:45 p.m., the one about confirming a surgery he could not pay for, something inside Tobiah Vasquez finally broke. Because how do you confirm something you can't afford? How do you say yes, go ahead, when you know the bill will crush you? How do you walk into a hospital and tell your daughter everything will be fine when you have no idea if that's true? You can't. And you can't stand in a kitchen seasoning lamb and pretending the world isn't ending either. That's why he left. Not because he wanted to. Because his body simply could not pretend anymore. His hands shook, his eyes burned, and the kitchen, the place that had been his home for 22 years, suddenly felt like a room he didn't deserve to stand in. Now he sat in the dark, in a foggy parking lot, staring up at the 4th floor of Pacific Bay Medical Center. Paloma's floor, room 412. The window was dark. She was sleeping. She didn't know he was out here. She had called him that morning. Her voice was tired but steady, braver than she should have to be at 19. "Go cook your dinner, Papa," she had said. "Mr. Eastwood needs you tonight." "You need me more," he whispered. "I need you to be strong," she said. "I need you to not fall apart." "You falling apart doesn't help me, Papa. Go cook. Make something beautiful. I'll be here when you're done." So he had tried. God, how he had tried. He went to the kitchen. He prepped the lamb. He sharpened his knives. He laid out the herbs in little glass bowls, the way he always did. But when that text came through, "Please reply to confirm," his hands started shaking, and they wouldn't stop. His phone buzzed now. In the dark truck, in the empty parking lot. A call, not a text. He looked at the screen. It was Sable. He didn't answer. It buzzed again, and again. Then it stopped. A minute later, a voicemail notification appeared. He pressed play and held the phone against his ear. "Tobiah," Sable's voice. Calm but tight, like a rope pulled to its limit. "I don't know what's going on, but you need to come back. Tonight. Not for the dinner. The dinner is handled. For you. Clint has something. I can't explain it in a message. Just please, please come back." He pulled the phone away from his ear. He stared at the screen. Come back? Why? What could possibly be waiting for him in that house that was more important than sitting outside his daughter's hospital window in the dark? He looked up at the 4th floor, at the dark window of room 412, at the place where the only thing that mattered in his whole life lay sleeping under thin white sheets. He closed his eyes, and he didn't move. $387,000, a growth the size of a grape. A father who has tried everything and has nothing left. But Sable said Clint has something she can't explain. What is waiting back at that house? What has Clint Eastwood been doing for 17 days? Back at the dinner table, the second course arrived. Clint carried out the bowls himself, one at a time. A rich, golden broth with hand-torn pasta floating like little clouds, flecks of fresh parsley scattered across the surface, and a warmth rising from each bowl that you could feel on your face before the spoon even touched your lips. Darnell picked up his bowl with both hands. He held it close and breathed in slow through his nose. His eyes went wide. "That's Tobiah's wedding soup," he said. He set the bowl down like it was made of glass. I'd know it anywhere. He made this for my daughter's wedding, 12 years ago. I almost cried at the table that night. Yes, it is, Clint said. He taught you this one too? He didn't teach me, not on purpose. Clint sat down in his usual spot, the middle of the table, never the head. He picked up his spoon, but he didn't eat, not yet. I learned it from watching. Standing in the doorway while he worked. He never knew I was paying that much attention. Darnell shook his head slowly. You never stop, do you? 60 years of directing movies, watching actors, watching light, watching everything. You can't turn it off. No, Clint said quietly. I can't. He looked at the empty chair again. The room noticed. 22 people lifting spoons, tearing bread, sipping wine, and every single one of them stealing glances at that chair, at the white envelope sitting on the seat, at the empty space where a plate should be but wasn't. The candles flickered. The room was warm and golden and full of the sounds that a good dinner makes. Soft voices, gentle laughter, the clink of silver on ceramic. But underneath all of it, there was a hush, a heaviness, like the room itself was holding something it didn't know how to put down. It was Lenora Vance who finally said it out loud. She set her spoon on the edge of her bowl. She folded her hands on the table. She looked straight at Clint with those clear, steady eyes that had stared down 40 years of school children. The eyes that could make a room full of 8-year-olds go silent without raising her voice. Clint, honey, she said. Are you going to tell us about that chair? Because it's been looking at me since I sat down, and I'm too old to keep pretending I don't see it. A few people chuckled, nervous laughs. The kind that come out when someone says the thing everyone else was thinking, but nobody had the nerve to speak. Clint set down his own spoon. He folded his hands the same way Lenora had. Two people mirroring each other across the candlelight. He took a slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes before he steps off a ledge. Not a scary ledge, but a high one. That chair, he said, is for someone who doesn't know it's here. Who? Lenora asked. You'll see. When? When he gets here. A pause, a breath. If he gets here. Lenora's eyes narrowed. She studied his face the way she had studied thousands of faces over 4 decades of teaching, looking for the truth behind the words. Looking for the thing a person says with their jaw and their forehead and the corners of their mouth when their lips are saying something else entirely. It's for Tobiah, she said. Not a question, a fact. The table went still. Spoons stopped. Glasses paused. Even the candle flames seemed to hold their breath. Clint looked at Lenora for a long, quiet moment. Then he nodded. Once. Slow. The kind of nod that carries the weight of a whole conversation in a single movement of the head. Why isn't he here? Lenora asked. Her voice had changed. It was softer now. The teacher was gone. The woman was here. Clint looked down at the table. He ran his thumb along the edge of his water glass. Around and around. A slow, careful circle. Because sometimes, he said, the people who hold everyone else together are the ones who are falling apart inside, and they don't want anyone to see it. They can't stand the thought of being the one who needs help, so they leave. They walk out. They sit alone in the dark somewhere, carrying it by themselves, because that's the only way they know. Nobody spoke. Margot pressed her napkin against her eyes and held it there. Kester Obi looked down at his soup like it held answers. Darnell gripped his wineglass so tight his knuckles went pale. Lenora's chin trembled, but she didn't look away from Clint, not once. Is he okay? She whispered. Clint looked at the envelope on the chair. He looked at it the way a man looks at a letter he's been writing in his head for weeks. A letter that holds everything he can't say out loud. Not yet. Not to a room full of people. Not without the person it was written for. He will be, Clint said. After tonight, he will be. That was all he would say. He picked up his spoon. He took a bite of soup. And with that single gesture, a man eating, he closed the conversation like closing a door, gently, but completely. The dinner continued, but it was different now. The laughter was softer, the voices were lower, the glances were longer. It was no longer a dinner party, it was a vigil. 22 people eating a meal cooked by a 96-year-old man, for reasons they didn't fully understand. while an empty chair at the head of the table waited for someone who might never walk through the door. Every few minutes, someone would look toward the kitchen, hoping to hear the crunch of gravel outside, hoping to see the door swing open, hoping to see Tobias standing there in his wrinkled shirt with dust on his shoes and tears on his face. He didn't come. The minutes passed. The candles burned lower. The soup went cold in the bowls of people who had forgotten to eat, and the chair kept waiting. The people who hold everyone else together are the ones who are falling apart inside. Clint said it like he'd been thinking about it for a long time, like he'd watched it happen, like he'd seen Tobias carrying this weight and said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he was already building the answer. That answer is in the envelope, but Tobias is 60 miles away, in a dark truck, outside a hospital, not moving. Who's going to bring him home? The dining room settled into that quiet, tender space between courses. The kind of silence that only happens when a group of people has heard something true and needs a moment to let it land. Plates were cleared. Wine was poured. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to a low bed of orange coals that pulsed like a heartbeat. Clint sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a glass of water. He hadn't touched his wine all night. His apron was still on. There was a smudge of dried broth on the sleeve of his undershirt. He looked tired, deeply, honestly tired. But not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from holding something heavy in your chest for too many days. Darnell leaned over. He had known Clint longer than anyone in this room. Longer than anyone alive, maybe. 50 years of trail rides and phone calls and bottles of wine from that tiny vineyard nobody else could find. "Tell them the story," Darnell said quietly. Clint shook his head. "Not tonight." "Yes, tonight. Right now. They need to hear it." "Hear what?" Margot asked from across the table. Her eyes were still red from pressing the napkin against them. Darnell looked at her. He looked at the whole table. 22 faces turned toward him like flowers toward the sun. "How Tobias saved Clint's life," he said. The room stopped breathing. Clint closed his eyes. He kept them closed for 3 full seconds. When he opened them, he looked at Darnell with an expression that said 100 things at once. Gratitude, frustration, love, exhaustion. All folded into a single look between two men who had known each other longer than some countries have existed. "That's a strong word," Clint said. "Saved." "It's the right word," Darnell said. "And you know it." Clint rubbed his jaw with his knuckles. He looked around the table. Good faces, honest faces, people he had chosen to have in his home, in his life, people who had earned the truth. He made a decision. 13 years ago, Clint began, I lost someone very close to me. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. Some of the people at the table had been there. Some had sent flowers. Some had stood beside him at a service on a gray morning and watched him stand so still that he looked like he was carved from wood. It was the worst time of my life. I won't go into the details. That's not what this story is about. But I'll tell you this much. For about 6 months after, I couldn't work. Not really. I showed up on set. I said my lines. I sat in the director's chair. But I was gone. Hollowed out. Like somebody had taken a spoon and scraped everything out of me and left just the shell. He paused. The coals in the fireplace popped. A log shifted and sent a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Everyone backed off. The staff. My friends. Even people in this room. He didn't say it with blame. He said it like weather, like it was just what happened. They gave me space. They were careful, quiet, polite. They tiptoed around me like I was made of glass. And I understand why. I do. Nobody wants to say the wrong thing. He took a slow breath. But it wasn't what I needed. What did you need? Lenora asked. Tobias, Clint said. He looked at the empty chair. Every single morning during those 6 months, I'd come downstairs and Tobias would be in the kitchen. Same time, same spot, same apron. And he wouldn't ask how I was doing. He wouldn't give me that look. Clint tilted his head slightly. You know the look I'm talking about. The "are you okay" look that really means, please don't make me deal with your sadness because I don't know how. A few people at the table shifted in their seats. They knew the look. They had given the look. Some of them had given it to Clint. Tobias didn't do that. He just cooked. He'd set a plate in front of me and say one word. Eat. That's it. No speeches. No therapy. No advice. Just food. The right food. The food that reminded me of what it felt like to be alive. Clint's voice was steady, but his hand on the water glass was pressing hard enough to turn his fingertips white. One morning, I remember it was raining, because the sound on the kitchen roof was so loud we had to almost shout. I came down and I couldn't eat. I couldn't even look at the food. I pushed the plate away, and Tobias stood on the other side of the island, looking at me. He didn't say, eat. He didn't say, it's going to be okay. He didn't say any of the things people say when they're trying to help but don't know how. Clint stopped. He pressed his lips together. He breathed through his nose. You know what he said? 22 people leaned forward. Not on purpose. Their bodies just moved. Like gravity had shifted and the center of the room was now Clint's mouth. He said, Mr. Eastwood, my mother used to tell me that food is a promise. When you eat, you are promising the world that you will stay for one more day. The room cracked open. Margot covered her face with both hands. Kester set down his coffee cup and stared at the tablecloth like it held the answer to something he'd been asking for years. Lenora pressed her fist against her lips and held it there. Darnell closed his eyes and nodded, because he'd heard this story before, and it hit him exactly the same way every single time. And then, Clint said, he pushed the plate back toward me. His voice broke. Not a big break. A hairline crack. A fracture so thin you'd miss it if you weren't listening with your whole body. I ate. He cleared his throat. He took a sip of water. He set the glass down. After that, things got a little better. Slowly. Not because of that one sentence, but because of what was behind it. Tobias wasn't trying to fix me. He wasn't trying to cheer me up. He was just refusing to let me disappear. Morning after morning, plate after plate, he showed up and he stayed and he didn't leave. Darnell opened his eyes. They were wet. He didn't wipe them. So yes, Clint said, looking at his oldest friend. He saved my life. You're right. Not with some big speech, not with some grand gesture, with a plate of food and the stubbornness to keep putting it in front of me when I wanted to push the whole world away. The table was silent, not uncomfortable silence, sacred silence, the kind that happens in churches and hospital rooms and at the edges of oceans at dawn, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because filling it would ruin it. Clint let it sit for a moment. Then he spoke again, lower now, closer to a whisper. Now that same man, that same stubborn, proud, beautiful man, is going through the hardest thing he has ever faced in his life. And he walked out of this house tonight thinking he was alone, thinking nobody knew, thinking he had to carry it by himself, because that's what strong men do. He looked at each person around the table, one by one, slowly, making sure every set of eyes met his. He's not alone. He just doesn't know it yet. Margot wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. What's happening to him, Clint? Please. It's not my story to tell, not the details. That belongs to Tobias. But I will tell you this much. He paused. His daughter Paloma is sick. She needs help. The kind of help that costs more money than a good man with a good heart and honest hands can afford. 22 people sat in their chairs, and 22 hearts broke at the exact same time. You could almost hear it. A quiet, collective crack, like ice on a pond in early spring. And that envelope? Lenora pointed one trembling finger at the chair. Clint looked at it. He looked at it with an expression that held everything. Every midnight cooking lesson, every plate of food pushed across a counter, every quiet morning when Tobias showed up and refused to let him disappear. That envelope, Clint said, is my answer. Food is a promise. When you eat, you are promising the world that you will stay for one more day. Tobias said those words 13 years ago. He saved Clint with a plate of food and the courage to keep showing up. Now Clint is trying to save him back. But Tobias is still sitting in a dark parking lot, still alone, still breaking. Someone needs to go get him. Fennec brought out dessert, small glass dishes of panna cotta, each one smooth as cream-colored silk. A golden drizzle of honey traced slow lines across the top. Crushed pistachios, bright green, almost too pretty to eat, were scattered over the surface like tiny pieces of sea glass. Fennec set them down gently, one in front of each guest. He moved around the table without a word, because he understood that this room had become something more than a dining room, and the silence it held was not his to break. Nobody reached for their spoon right away. The story about Tobiah, about the plate pushed across the counter, about the promise of food, about a man who showed up every morning for 6 months and refused to let Clint Eastwood vanish, still hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just gone out. Margot was the first to take a bite. She lifted the spoon slowly. She put it in her mouth. She closed her eyes. And then she made a sound. Not a word, just a small, soft sound. The kind of sound a person makes when something reaches past their tongue and touches something deeper. Something behind the ribs, something in the memory. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, this is—" She couldn't finish. Kester tried it next. He held the spoon in his mouth for a long time. His eyebrows lifted, his head tilted. Then he set the spoon down and looked at Clint. "Cinnamon," he said. "And something else, something warm underneath. What is that?" Clint almost smiled, the closest he'd come to a real smile all night. It reached one corner of his mouth and stayed there, small and private. "A pinch of Mexican chocolate," he said, "ground fine, almost to dust. You can barely taste it, but you feel it. That's Tobiah's secret. He puts it in everything sweet, says his mother did the same thing." "Rosalita," Darnell said softly, like a prayer. "You knew her?" Margot asked. She turned to Darnell with her spoon still suspended in the air. "Met her once," Darnell said. He leaned back in his chair and let his eyes drift toward the ceiling, like the memory was stored up there somewhere. "Clint flew her out from Oaxaca about 15 years ago. She was tiny, couldn't have been 5 feet tall, wore a white dress and sandals. Had hands like leather, strong, dark, cracked at the knuckles from 50 years of cooking over open fire." He shook his head slowly. "But she walked into that kitchen and took over like she owned it. Didn't ask permission, didn't wait for instructions, just walked in, tied on an apron, and started pulling things off the shelves." Tobiah stood in the corner the whole time, laughing like a kid watching his mother do magic. "She made tamales," Clint said. "In banana leaves, right there at that counter. I sat on a stool and watched her for 3 hours. She talked the whole time, in Spanish mostly." Tobiah translated. "She told stories about her village, about the old markets, about how she used to carry water on her head as a girl when the well was a mile from the house." "Where is she now?" Lenora asked. She asked it gently, like she already knew the answer and was just giving Clint the space to say it. "She passed," Clint said. 7 years ago. In her sleep. Peaceful." Tobiah flew down for the funeral, was gone for 2 weeks. When he came back, he didn't talk about it. Not one word. He just went straight to the kitchen, picked up his knives, and started cooking. Everyone at the table understood what that meant. They understood it in their bones. Tobiah cooked through grief the way other people pray or run, or cry, or sit alone in dark rooms. The kitchen was his church, his language, his lifeline. It was the one place in the world where he could take the things that hurt and turn them into something that healed. And now that lifeline had been cut, not by choice, by a number. $387,000. A number so large it might as well have been a wall built across the doorway of everything Tobiah had ever worked for. "That's why tonight matters," Clint said. He set down his water glass. He looked at every face around the table, one at a time, the way a man counts the people he trusts before he walks into battle. "That man has poured his heart into this kitchen for 22 years. He has fed me. He has fed every single one of you. He has shown up when nobody asked him to, and stayed long past the point where he could have walked away. He gave me his mornings and his evenings and his holidays and his hands." He paused. "And tonight was supposed to be for him." The room shifted, like a boat tilting on a wave. Every spine straightened. Every pair of eyes widened. "This whole dinner," Clint said, "every course, every candle, every guest sitting at this table, it was supposed to be my way of saying thank you. My way of telling Tobiah Vasquez that after 22 years of cooking in my house, he is not my employee." He stopped, swallowed, set his jaw. "He's my family." Margot let out a sob. Not a quiet one. A real one. The kind that comes from the center of the chest and doesn't ask permission. "He didn't know," Clint said. "That was the plan. He would cook the dinner, his dinner, in his honor. And after the last course, I would stand up and hand him that envelope. And he would finally know what he means to me, what he means to all of us. But he left, Lenora said. He left because of Paloma. Because of Paloma. The table was quiet. The panna cotta was melting in the dishes. The honey was pooling. The pistachios were sinking into soft white cream. Nobody cared. Nobody could eat now, not after this. Darnell set down his napkin. He pressed both palms flat on the table like a man steadying himself on a moving train. "What's in the envelope, Clint?" Clint looked at him, looked at all of them, and for the first time all night, the very first time, the mask came off. All of it. The calm, the steadiness, the stone-faced strength that had carried him through 3 hours of cooking and 5 hours of holding a room together with nothing but willpower and an apron. It fell away. And what was underneath was not sadness, not grief, not exhaustion. It was love. The fierce, stubborn, immovable love of a man who had decided, 17 days ago, alone in his study, on the phone with a surgeon he had never met, that he was going to fix this, no matter what it cost, no matter what it took. Everything Tobiah needs, Clint said, but he didn't say more. Not yet. Not until Tobiah was sitting in that chair, hearing it with his own ears, holding it with his own hands. If he came back, if. The clock on the wall read 9:48 p.m., and somewhere in San Francisco, in a foggy parking lot outside a hospital, where a 19-year-old girl slept with a grape-sized shadow in her brain, a phone was ringing again. The dinner was never for the guests. It was always for Tobiah, and the envelope holds everything Clint has been building in secret for 17 days. But Tobiah isn't here to receive it. He's 60 miles away, alone, broken. Someone has to go get him. Someone has to close the distance. And someone just did. Her name is Sable. Sable Greer did not ask permission. She didn't tell Clint she was leaving. She didn't check with Fennec. She didn't stop to think about whether this was her place, or her business, or her role. She had spent 11 years managing schedules, seating charts, flower arrangements, and the quiet machinery of a famous man's household. Tonight, none of that mattered. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the back door. She found her car keys in the pocket. She pulled out her phone and checked Tobiah's location one more time, not through any app or tracker, but through the only clue she had. 2 weeks ago, she had been walking past the cottage behind the main house. Tobiah's door was open. He was sitting at his kitchen table with his back to her, talking on the phone. His voice was low and strained. She hadn't meant to listen, but she heard 3 words before she walked away. Pacific Bay Medical. She remembered them. She had tucked them away in that quiet corner of her mind where she kept the things she wasn't supposed to know, but couldn't forget. The look on Tobiah's face that week. The way his hands shook when he thought nobody was watching. The morning she found him standing in the walk-in refrigerator, not getting anything, just standing there in the cold with his eyes closed. She hadn't said a word, because it wasn't her place. But tonight, place didn't matter anymore. Tonight, a man she cared about was sitting alone somewhere in the dark, and a white envelope was sitting on a chair waiting for him, and 22 people were holding their breath around a dinner table, and every second that passed was a second wasted. Sable got in her car and drove. The road from Carmel to San Francisco was nearly 2 hours in good traffic. At this time of night, 9:52 p.m. on a Saturday, the highway was nearly empty. Just long stretches of black pavement and the pale sweep of headlights cutting through fog that rolled in from the coast like slow white waves. She drove fast, faster than she should have. The speedometer crept past 80, past 85. The fog thickened. She didn't slow down. She thought about Tobiah, not the chef, not the man in the white coat who ran the kitchen with the precision of a surgeon and the gentleness of a priest. She thought about the other Tobiah, the one most people never saw, the one who left a cup of chamomile tea on her desk every single night she worked late. Never with a note, never with a word, just a cup, always the right temperature, always exactly when she needed it most. She'd look up from her papers at 10 p.m. and there it would be, steaming, waiting, like magic. She thought about the time her own mother got sick, 3 years ago. Sable had taken a week off. When she came back, the first thing she saw on her desk was a small glass jar of soup, Tobiah's chicken soup. the one with hand-torn noodles and fresh dill, with a piece of tape on the lid that said, in Tobia's careful handwriting, "For when you're ready." Not feel better, not sorry for your loss, just for when you're ready. She had cried at her desk that day, alone, with the jar in her hands. They never talked about it. That was how their friendship worked. It lived in the spaces between words. In cups of tea and jars of soup, and the way Tobiah always held the door for her when her arms were full of files, and the way she always covered for him on the rare days he needed time off. No questions asked. 11 years of that. 11 years of a friendship built not on long conversations but on small, steady acts of kindness that never asked for anything in return. Now, driving through the fog at 87 miles an hour on a dark highway with her knuckles white on the steering wheel, Sable realized she was angry. Not at Tobiah. Never at Tobiah. At the world. At the blind, stupid cruelty of a world where a man who had spent his entire life feeding other people, nourishing them, caring for them, standing over hot stoves and sharpening knives and waking at 4:30 every single morning for 22 years, could not afford to save his own daughter. What kind of world does that? What kind of world takes a man like Tobiah Vasquez and makes him beg? She pressed the gas pedal harder. The needle touched 90. At 11:17 p.m., she pulled into the parking lot of Pacific Bay Medical Center. The building glowed white against the dark sky. Tall, clean, cold. The kind of building that holds both the best and worst moments of people's lives inside the same walls. She circled the lot slowly, looking, scanning every row, every corner, every shadow. She was looking for Tobiah's truck. An old blue Ford with a dent in the tailgate from the time he backed into a fence post 5 years ago and never got it fixed. A small wooden cross hanging from the rearview mirror. A bumper sticker that Paloma had put there when she was 12. A cartoon sun with the words "Shine Anyway" in yellow letters. She found it in the far corner of the lot, under a broken streetlight. The engine was off, the windows were dark and fogged. Sable parked beside it. She turned off her engine. She sat for a moment, just breathing, letting her hands stop shaking. Then she got out. The air was cold. It smelled like eucalyptus and wet concrete and the sharp, clean scent that cities have at night when the traffic stops and the world gets quiet enough to hear itself. She walked to the driver's side of the blue truck. She looked through the window. Tobiah was asleep. He sat in the driver's seat, leaned against the doorframe, with his balled-up chef's coat wedged under his head like a pillow. His face was drawn and gray. Even in sleep, worry lines cut deep into his forehead. Grooves carved by 3 weeks of fear and shame, and the kind of exhaustion that no amount of rest can touch. His phone was in his lap. The screen was dark. He had stopped answering hours ago. Sable tapped on the window, gently. 2 soft knocks. The way you knock on a child's door when you don't want to scare them. Tobiah's eyes opened. For a moment, he looked confused, lost. Like a man who had fallen asleep in one world and woken up in another. His eyes moved around the dark cab of the truck, the fogged windows, the parking lot lights, the hospital glowing above him. Then he saw Sable, and his face crumpled. Not anger, not surprise, just a breaking. The face a person makes when they have been holding themselves together with everything they have, and then someone shows up, just stands there, just looks at them through a window with kind eyes, and the holding becomes impossible. He opened the door. Sable? His voice was hoarse. Scrapped raw. How did you? Move over, she said. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, and climbed in. The truck smelled like garlic and old leather and the faint ghost of rosemary. They sat together, in silence, in the dark. In a fogged-up truck in the far corner of a hospital parking lot, at 11:20 on a Saturday night. Sable didn't push. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say, "It's going to be okay," or "Tell me what's wrong," or any of the things people say when they mean well, but don't know what to do. She just sat there, being there. Because sometimes that's the only thing that helps. Not words, not solutions, not fixing, just a person, sitting next to you, breathing the same air, telling you, without saying a single word, that you are not alone in this truck. You are not alone in this parking lot. You are not alone in this dark, terrifying night. You are not alone. Finally, after a long time, Tobias spoke. His voice came out cracked and thin, like paper left out in the rain. She's on the 4th floor, room 412. She's sleeping. He swallowed. They've got her on medication to manage the pressure. But if they don't operate within the next 2 weeks... He couldn't finish. The sentence just stopped, like a road that runs out at the edge of a cliff. I know, Sable said. He turned to look at her. Sharp, fast. The first real energy he'd shown all night. You know, I overheard a phone call 2 weeks ago. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. Tobias leaned back against the headrest. He closed his eyes. A long breath left his body, the kind of breath that sounds like it's been trapped inside for weeks. The surgery costs almost $400,000, he said. His eyes stayed closed. I've called every bank, every loan company, every charity I could find on the internet. I've filled out forms until my eyes burned. I even thought about... His voice broke. He pressed his fist against his mouth. I even thought about asking Clint, but I couldn't. I just couldn't do it. Why not? Tobias opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling of his truck. Because he's already given me everything, Sable. Everything. This job, this life, the cottage, the chance to raise Paloma somewhere safe, somewhere with good schools and clean air, and an ocean she could hear from her bedroom window. He shook his head. I can't ask that man for one more thing. It wouldn't be right. He's done enough, more than enough. Sable turned in her seat to face him. The parking lot light cast long shadows across both their faces, half lit, half dark, like two people standing at the border between one world and another. Tobias, she said, you need to come back to the house. He shook his head. I can't go back there. Not tonight. I walked out on them. I left 3 hours before. Clint cooked the dinner. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Tobias blinked. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His forehead creased into deep lines of confusion. What? Clint cooked the dinner himself, every course, every plate. The lamb, the risotto, the wedding soup, your panna cotta, with the chocolate. He stood in your spot at the center island, and he cooked for 3 straight hours. Tobias stared at her. His eyes were wide. His lips moved, but nothing came out. He looked like a man who had just been told that the earth was flat, or that the ocean was made of glass, or that something impossible had happened, while he was sitting in the dark feeling sorry for himself. Clint cooked? Yes. The whole dinner? The whole dinner. For all 22 guests, in your apron. Tobias pressed both hands over his face. He held them there. His shoulders shook, but no sound came out. Whatever was happening behind those hands was too big for sound. And there's something else, Sable said. She kept her voice steady, calm. The same voice she used when everything was falling apart and someone needed to be the ground. Something at the house. I don't know exactly what it is, but Clint has been planning something for weeks. There's a chair at the table, Tobias. An empty chair, at the head of the table, with an envelope on it. Tobias pulled his hands away from his face. His eyes were red and wet. An envelope? A white envelope, with your name on it, in Clint's handwriting. What's in it? I don't know. He won't tell anyone, but I've worked for that man for 11 years, and I have never, not once, seen him look the way he looked tonight when he talked about you. The parking lot was silent. Somewhere far away, a siren rose and fell like a distant heartbeat. A car passed on the street outside, its headlights sweeping across the fog and disappearing. Tobias looked at the hospital, at the 4th floor, at the dark window of room 412 where his daughter, his Paloma, his light, his best recipe, lay sleeping. Then he looked at Sable. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. Something moved behind his eyes. Not hope. Not yet. Something before hope. The thing that has to happen first. Decision. Take me home, he said. She drove 90 miles an hour through the fog to find him. She didn't bring speeches. She didn't bring answers. She brought the only thing that mattered, herself. And now Tobias is coming home. To a table full of people who love him. To a chair that's been waiting all night. To a white envelope with his name on it. What's inside that envelope? You're about to find out. They drove back in separate cars, Sable in hers, Tobias in his truck. Two sets of headlights cutting through the fog on a dark highway, one following the other like a promise, keeping pace with a prayer. Tobiah gripped the steering wheel with both hands. He hadn't driven this fast in years. The old blue Ford rattled at 75. The wooden cross swung from the rearview mirror in small, steady circles. The chef's coat lay crumpled on the passenger seat where he had thrown it 6 hours ago, when the world was a different shape. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't want noise. He wanted to think. But every time he tried to line up his thoughts, they scattered like birds spooked from a wire. Clint cooked the dinner. An empty chair. An envelope with his name on it. None of it made sense. Or maybe it all made sense, and Tobiah was just too tired and too scared and too broken to see the shape of it yet. Like standing too close to a painting. All you see is color and brushstrokes. You have to step back to see what it is. He wasn't ready to step back. Not yet. Not until he was standing in that kitchen. In his spot, where the tile was worn smooth from 22 years of his feet. It was past midnight when they pulled into the gravel driveway. The house was still lit. Every window glowed warm and golden, like a lantern left burning for someone lost at sea. The lanterns along the stone path still flickered. From somewhere inside, the faint sound of voices drifted through the walls, low and murmuring, like people talking in a church. The dinner was still going. At midnight, every guest was still there. Nobody had left. Tobiah turned off the engine. He sat in his truck for a moment. He looked at the house. He had walked through that kitchen door 10,000 times, maybe more, in summer heat and winter rain, before sunrise and after midnight, carrying bags of groceries, trays of roasted meat, crates of vegetables from the farm stand down the road. 10,000 times, and it had never felt like this. Tonight, it felt like walking into something he couldn't predict, something waiting on the other side of that door that would change the shape of his life. He could feel it the way you feel thunder before you hear it. A pressure in the air, a vibration in the ground, a knowing that something is about to break open. He was scared. Sable appeared at his window. She had parked beside him and walked over without him hearing. She leaned down and looked at him through the glass. She didn't knock this time. She just waited. He opened the door. "Ready?" she asked. He wasn't, not even close. But he nodded anyway, because sometimes courage isn't about being ready. It's about going forward, when every part of you wants to stay in the truck. They walked up the stone path together, side by side. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel. The night air was cold and clean, and smelled like salt from the ocean below the cliffs. Sable opened the kitchen door. The kitchen was spotless. Every surface wiped clean. Every pot washed and stacked. Every counter cleared. The stove was off. The oven was cool. Only the smell remained, warm and layered, like a story told in herbs and butter and slow-roasted meat. Clint had cooked a full dinner for 22 people, and then he had cleaned up after himself. Tobiah stood in the doorway and looked at his kitchen. His kitchen, the room where he had spent more hours than any other room in his life, where Rosalita had made tamales in banana leaves, where Paloma had sat on the counter as a little girl, swinging her legs and eating scraps of cheese while he cooked, where he had fed hundreds of people over 2 decades and never once thought of it as work. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see the dining room. The table was still full. Every guest was still seated. At midnight, some held coffee cups cradled in both hands. Some had pushed their chairs back and crossed their legs. Some sat close together, shoulders touching, hands resting on the table near each other. The candles had burned down to small golden stubs, their flames no bigger than fingertips. They were waiting. All of them. 22 people who had stayed past midnight because something in this room was unfinished. Something that couldn't end without him. And at the head of the table, his chair, the empty chair, with the white envelope resting on the seat. Clint saw him first. He was sitting in his usual spot, the middle of the table. His apron was still on. There was a shadow of exhaustion under his eyes that Tobiah had never seen before. The great Clint Eastwood looked like a man who had poured everything he had into this night and had nothing left in the tank. But when he saw Tobiah standing in the kitchen doorway, wrinkled shirt, road dust on his shoes, red eyes, trembling hands, something happened to his face. It softened, not a movie star softening, not the kind of expression you rehearse in a mirror, or practice for a camera. Something unrehearsed. Something that came from a place so deep inside the chest that it didn't have a name. The way a father's face changes when his child walks through the door after being gone too long. The way the whole world rearranges itself around a single moment of relief. He stood up. The whole table turned. 22 people saw Tobias Vasquez standing in the doorway. A man in wrinkled clothes with dust on his shoes and salt on his cheeks, and the look of someone who had been lost at sea for 3 weeks and had just this second, spotted land. Lenora Vance pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes filled instantly. Darnell stood up from his chair, slowly, like a man rising for something sacred. Margot started crying. She didn't try to stop it. She didn't reach for a napkin. She just let it come. And Clint walked toward Tobias, slowly, one step at a time, the way you walk toward something precious. Something you've been waiting for all night, something you weren't sure would come. He stopped in front of him, close, an arm's length away. They were the same height now. Clint had lost an inch or two over the years, and Tobias had always been average. They stood eye to eye, two men. One doorway, 22 years between them and not a single inch of distance. You came back, Clint said. Sable said there was a chair. There is. And an envelope. There is. Tobias' chin trembled. His jaw clenched and unclenched. His eyes burned. Clint, I need to tell you something. I should have told you weeks ago. My daughter, I know about Paloma. 4 words. Quiet as snowfall. Heavy as stone. Tobias went still. Completely still. Like every muscle in his body had locked at the same time. You know? I've known for 17 days. How? Clint looked at him. Steady. Unblinking. With those sharp, clear eyes that had seen more of the world than most people could imagine. Because I pay attention, Tobias, the same way you've paid attention to me for 22 years. His voice was low and firm and kind, all at once. You thought you were hiding it. The shaking hands. The red eyes. Standing in the walk-in cooler with your eyes closed, leaving the room to take phone calls. You thought nobody noticed. He paused. You weren't hiding anything. Tobias' legs went weak. He reached for the door frame. His hand found the wood and gripped it hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Come sit down, Clint said. He put his hand on Tobias' shoulder, the same way he had 22 years ago, in a tiny Italian restaurant in Carmel, when he'd put his arm around a shy young cook who held a wooden spoon like a sword and didn't know that his whole life was about to change. He guided Tobias across the dining room, past the guests, past the candles, past the faces of 22 people who were watching, with tears running down their cheeks and hands pressed against their hearts, to the chair, the empty chair, at the head of the table. Tobias sat down. The chair was warm. Someone had been sitting near it all night, keeping the space alive. He looked at the faces around the table. 22 people he had cooked for, people whose birthdays he remembered, whose favorite dishes he knew by heart, whose allergies and preferences and little food secrets he had memorized the way a musician memorizes a song. They were looking at him now with so much love that it hurt, that it physically hurt, like a hand reaching into his chest and squeezing. And beside him, on the seat where he now sat, the white envelope. Clint stood behind the chair. He placed both hands on Tobias' shoulders. Heavy, warm, steady. Open it, he said. Tobias picked up the envelope. It was heavier than he expected. His name was written on the front in Clint's handwriting. Clean, square letters that leaned slightly to the right, the way they always did. Tobias. Just his name, nothing else. But somehow that single word, in that handwriting, on that envelope, held more meaning than whole books Tobias had read in his life. His hands shook, but a different kind of shaking now. Not fear, not grief, not the shaking of a man whose body can't hold what his heart is carrying. Something else, something he hadn't felt in 3 weeks, something he had forgotten was possible. He slid his finger under the seal. The paper tore softly. He reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Heavy stock, cream-colored, folded once. He unfolded it. He began to read. And the room watched. 22 guests, one house manager standing in the kitchen doorway with mascara running down her face, one sous chef and one kitchen assistant peering through the crack in the kitchen door, as Tobiah Marin Vasquez, a man who had crossed a border with nothing, who had cooked 10,000 meals in this house, who had saved Clint Eastwood's life with a plate of food and a sentence about promises, who had held everyone else together while his own world cracked and crumbled beneath his feet, began to cry. Not quiet tears, not the polite, held-back kind that you wipe away with a knuckle and pretend didn't happen. Deep, shaking, world-breaking sobs, the kind that come from the bottom of the ocean, the kind that shake the table and rattle the glasses and make every person in the room stop breathing because they have never heard a sound like that before. A sound that is not sadness, not relief, not joy, but all three at once, twisted together, pouring out of a man who has been silent for too long. Because now he knew, now he understood everything. He's sitting in the chair, the envelope is open, the letter is in his hands, and the man who never cried is sobbing at the head of the table while 22 people hold their breath. What does the letter say? The letter was written by hand, every word, in Clint's handwriting, those clean, square letters that leaned slightly to the right, pressed firm into the cream-colored paper with a pen that left deep grooves you could feel with your fingertips. This is what it said. Dear Tobiah, 22 years ago, you cooked me a plate of pasta with garlic and lemon in a tiny restaurant in Carmel. It was a Tuesday night. The place was almost empty. I sat at the bar and asked for whatever the kitchen wanted to make. You made the simplest thing on the menu. Pasta, olive oil, garlic sliced thin, not crushed, lemon zest, fresh herbs from the garden behind the building. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, but it was the best meal I had ever eaten. Not because of the ingredients, because of the man who made it. I didn't know your story then. I didn't know about Rosalita. I didn't know about the border crossing. I didn't know about the storage rooms, or the rice bags, or the money you sent home every month. All I knew was that someone in that kitchen had cooked with love, real love, the kind you can taste. In the 22 years since that night, you have fed me through joy and through grief. You have stood in that kitchen when nobody asked you to. You have shown up every morning at 4:30, every single morning, Tobiah, and you have poured your heart into this house, into this family, into every single plate of food you have ever served. You saved my life once. You know the time I mean. A rainy morning, a plate I pushed away, and you pushed it back and said food is a promise. When you eat, you are promising the world that you will stay for one more day. I stayed. Because of you. In all those years, you never asked me for anything in return. Not once. Not a raise, not a favor. Not a single thing beyond what you earned with your hands and your hours and your sweat. You are the most proud man I have ever known, and I say that with nothing but respect. So I am not asking you now, Tobiah. I am telling you, Paloma's surgery has been paid for, in full. The $387,000 was transferred to Pacific Bay Medical Center 12 days ago. Dr. Kesslin Park has confirmed the operation for October 29th. The pre-operative consultation is scheduled. Everything is arranged. There is nothing left for you to worry about. Nothing left for you to solve. It is done. But there is more. I have set up an education trust in Paloma's name. It will cover the rest of her medical school. All of it. Every dollar. Tuition. Books. Housing. Lab fees. Everything she needs to finish what she started. When she graduates, and she will graduate, Tobiah, because she is her father's daughter, she will owe nothing to anyone. She will walk out of that school free and clear, with a degree in her hand and a future that belongs to her. And there is one more thing. The cottage behind this house, the one you have lived in for 22 years, the one where you raised Paloma, the one where Rosalita made tamales in the kitchen and Paloma stuck glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling of her bedroom, is now yours. The deed has been transferred to your name. It is not a loan. It is not a gift you need to pay back. It is not charity. It is yours. The way it has always been yours, even when your name wasn't on the paper. You are not my employee, Tobiah. You have not been my employee for a very long time. You are my brother. I should have said it years ago. I should have said it the morning you pushed the plate back toward me. I should have said it every single day since. I am saying it now. With everything I have and everything I am, Clint Tobiah read the letter once. Then he read it again. Slower this time, his eyes moving over each word like feet walking across holy ground. The paper shook in his hands. The ink blurred where his tears fell, small wet circles that spread through the cream-colored page like ripples in a pond. $387,000. Paid. 12 days ago. 12 days. While Tobiah had been lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of his cottage, doing math on scraps of paper with numbers that never added up, while he had been calling banks and getting put on hold and filling out forms that asked him to prove his worth in boxes too small to hold his life. While he had been standing in the walk-in cooler with his eyes closed, pressing his forehead against the cold metal shelf, trying to breathe, trying not to scream, trying to figure out how to save his daughter with hands that could only cook. It was already done. Clint had fixed it, quietly, without being asked, without saying a word, without making Tobiah feel small or helpless or weak, the same way Tobiah had fixed Clint 13 years ago. A plate of food pushed across a counter, a phone call made to a hospital. 2 men, 2 different moments, the same love. Tobiah set the letter down on the table. He pressed both palms flat on the wood, his fingers spread wide, his chest heaved, his whole body shook with something too big for his bones to hold. He looked up at Clint. Clint stood behind the chair, his hands still on Tobiah's shoulders, his face still soft, his eyes wet for the first time all night. The stone had cracked all the way through, and what was underneath was not weakness. It was the opposite. It was the strongest thing in the room. "You paid for it?" Tobiah whispered. His voice was barely there. A thread of sound stretched across a canyon. "Yes." 12 days ago? "Yes." "Well, I was..." He couldn't finish. The sentence dissolved. "While you were carrying it alone," Clint said. "Yes." Tobiah pressed his fist against his mouth. He bit down on his knuckle, hard, like he was trying to hold something inside that was too big to let out in front of all these people. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words came out broken, each one a separate piece. Clint squeezed his shoulders, firm, steady, the grip of a man who has no intention of letting go. "Because I wanted you to hear it here," he said, "in this room, at this table, with every person who loves you sitting around you. I didn't want you to hear it on the phone. I didn't want you to read it in a text. I wanted you to be sitting in this chair with these people and know, really know, in your bones, that you are not carrying this alone. You never were, not for one single second." Tobiah broke, not slowly, not in stages, all at once, like a dam that holds and holds and holds and then doesn't. He bent forward in the chair. His forehead almost touched the table. A sound came out of him that was not a word, not a cry. Something older than language. Something that lives underneath all the things we learn to say. The sound a man makes when a weight he has carried so long it became part of his body is suddenly, impossibly, lifted, and he doesn't know how to stand without it, doesn't know how to breathe without it, doesn't know who he is in a world where that weight is gone. Lenora stood up from her chair, slowly, because she was 87 and her knees hadn't been kind in a decade. But she stood, and she walked around the table, past Margot, past Kester, past Darnell, until she reached Tobiah. She didn't say a word. She wrapped her arms around him from behind. Her small hands clasped together over his chest. She pressed her cheek against the back of his head, and she held him, the way a teacher holds a child who has fallen on the playground, the way a mother holds a son who has come home after too long away. Then Darnell stood up, then Margot, then Kester, then Piers, then every single person at that table, one by one, like a wave that starts at the shore and rolls slowly, surely, all the way to the horizon. They gathered around Tobiah's chair, 22 people. Some put their hands on his shoulders, some touched his arms. Some just stood close, close enough for him to feel their warmth, close enough for their breathing to become part of his breathing. A circle, a wall, a family built not from blood, but from time and food, and the quiet accumulation of 22 years of showing up. Tobiah lifted his head. His face was a ruin, red and swollen and wet and broken open in a way that most people never let themselves be seen. He looked at their faces through the blur of his tears. He saw the candles, he saw the table, he saw the plates and glasses and napkins that he had arranged 1,000 times. He saw Sable standing in the kitchen doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, mascara in dark lines down both cheeks, smiling and crying at the same time. And he saw Clint, still behind him, hands still on his shoulders, solid as the cliffs outside the window, quiet as the dawn that would come in a few hours, and light up the ocean and start a new day. "You are my brother," Tobias said. His voice shook but did not break. "Not this time. You have always been my brother." Clint didn't speak. He couldn't, because the stone had cracked and the water was coming through, and if he opened his mouth, the whole dam would go. So he just squeezed Tobias' shoulders. Once, twice, and held on. Some things are bigger than words. This was one of them. The surgery is paid, the school is covered, the cottage is his. The brother he never had just gave him everything. But the night isn't over yet. There is one more chapter, one more moment, one more plate of food. And it will bring everything full circle. Later, much later, when the tears had slowed and the circle had loosened, and someone had poured fresh coffee, and someone else had rebuilt the fire, the full story came out. Not in pieces, not in hints. The whole thing, start to finish. Every phone call, every decision, every quiet move Clint Eastwood had made in the 17 days between finding out about Paloma and this moment right here, right now, in this dining room at midnight. Clint told it himself. He stood at the head of the table, next to Tobias. His apron was still on. His sleeves were still rolled up. He looked like a man who had been awake for 100 years and had decided that sleep could wait one more hour. 17 days ago, he began, I got a phone call. The room was still. The fire popped softly behind the grate. Coffee steamed in cups that nobody lifted. It was from a doctor in San Francisco, a woman named Kesslyn Park. She's a brain surgeon, one of the best in the country. She called me because she had a patient, a 19-year-old girl named Paloma Vasquez. Tobias sat in his chair, with the letter pressed flat against his chest. Both hands over it, like he was holding his own heart in place. The billing department had flagged something, Clint continued. Paloma's father had called the hospital 7 times in 1 week. 7 times, Tobias, asking about payment plans, financial aid, charity programs, anything. And every time, they told him the same thing. The surgery was classified as elective specialty. Insurance wouldn't touch it. The payment plans needed a down payment bigger than most people's savings. The charity funds were empty. Clint paused. He looked down at Tobias. Then he looked back at the room. Now Dr. Park is a surgeon. She's not a social worker. She doesn't usually call patients employers. That's not her job. But something about this case stuck with her. She told me later that it was Tobias' voice on those phone calls. She said he never raised it, never got angry, never begged. He just kept calling, kept asking, kept looking for a door that wasn't locked. Darnell closed his eyes. She looked up his employment information. She saw where he worked, and she called me. Clint's voice was flat. No drama, no decoration, just the facts, laid out one by one like stones placed in a row. She told me everything. The diagnosis, the location of the growth, the size, the risks if they didn't operate, the timeline. She told me that without surgery, Paloma's condition would get worse. Maybe slowly, maybe fast, but it would get worse. And the window for the best possible outcome was closing. The fire crackled. A log split and settled. Nobody in the room moved. I asked her one question, Clint said. I said, what does she need? And Dr. Park said, she needs the surgery, and her father needs to stop destroying himself trying to figure out how to pay for it. Tobias made a sound, small, muffled by the letter pressed against his mouth. So I paid for the surgery, Clint said. That same afternoon, I called the hospital billing office. I gave them my information. I paid the full amount, $387,000. Then I called Dr. Park back and told her to schedule the operation for whatever date was best for Paloma. October 29, Tobias whispered from behind the letter. October 29, Clint said. He took a slow breath. The room took it with him. But I didn't stop there. Darnell opened his eyes. You never do, he said quietly. Clint looked at his old friend. Something passed between them. 50 years of knowing each other compressed into a single glance. I called Paloma's university the next day. I spoke with the dean of the medical school. I told her I wanted to set up an education trust in Paloma's name. She asked me how much. I said however much it takes to get her to the finish line. All of it. Tuition, books, housing, lab fees, whatever she needs. He paused. The dean told me something. She said that Paloma Vasquez was one of the most exceptional students in their entire program, top of her class. The kind of student who makes the students around her better just by being in the room. She said Paloma had already been selected for a research fellowship and was on track to graduate with honors. Tobias' shoulders shook. A sound came out of him, not crying anymore, but something close to laughter. The broken, disbelieving laughter of a father hearing that his daughter is extraordinary and realizing, maybe for the first time, that it wasn't a dream. She was real, she was brilliant, and she was going to be okay. Then I called my lawyer, Clint said. I had the deed to the cottage transferred into Tobias' name. It took a few days for the paperwork, but it's done. Signed, recorded, legal. Why the cottage? Margot asked. Her voice was raw. She had stopped wiping her eyes a long time ago. Clint looked at her. Because a man should own the place where he raised his child, he said. It shouldn't belong to somebody else. It should be his. The walls that heard his daughter's first words should have his name on them. The garden where she learned to walk should be under his feet, on his ground, in his name. Margot pressed both hands flat on the table and lowered her head. Her shoulders rose and fell once, then again. Then she was still. Why didn't you tell me? Tobias asked. The same question. The third time now, but each time it meant something different. The first time was shock. The second was disbelief. This time it was something else. This time, it was the question underneath all the other questions. The real one. Why did you let me suffer when you had already fixed it? Clint heard the real question. He always heard the real question. That was one of his gifts, not as an actor, but as a man. 2 reasons, he said. He held up one finger. First, because if I had told you, you would have said no. Tobias opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Because it was true. You would have argued, Clint continued. You would have said it was too much. You would have tried to pay me back. You would have made it about pride and debt and the difference between a gift and a handout. And I didn't want to have that fight. Because this isn't a handout, Tobias, and it isn't a gift, it's a debt, my debt. For what you gave me 13 years ago when I wanted to disappear and you wouldn't let me. Tobias pressed the letter tighter against his chest. Second, Clint said. His voice dropped, lower now, closer to the ground. Closer to the place where the truest things live. I wanted you to feel what I felt. Tobias looked up. 13 years ago, when I was sitting in this house, hollow as a drum, you didn't ask me what I needed. You didn't give me a speech. You didn't sit me down and say, Clint, I'm going to help you. You just did it. You showed up. You stood in that kitchen. You put a plate in front of me and said one word, eat. The fire was low. The candles were nearly gone. The room breathed in the dark. You fixed it first. You told me later. That's what love looks like, Tobias. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for permission. It just shows up and does the work. He put his hand on Tobias' shoulder one more time. So that's what I did. I fixed it first, and now I'm telling you. The room was so still that you could hear the wax pooling at the base of the candles. You could hear the ocean outside, far below the cliffs, doing what it always does, coming in, going out, coming in, going out, steady and certain and older than everything in this room combined. 22 people sat in that stillness, and every single one of them understood something that they would carry for the rest of their lives. That love is not always loud. It's not always a grand gesture, or a speech, or a moment in a movie where the music swells and the camera pulls back and the credits roll. Sometimes love is a plate of food pushed across a counter on a rainy morning. Sometimes love is a phone call to a hospital billing office on a Tuesday afternoon. Sometimes love is a white envelope left on an empty chair. And sometimes love is a 96-year-old man standing in a kitchen at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, tying on an apron, rolling up his sleeves and cooking dinner for 22 people because the person he loves most in the world couldn't do it tonight. Tobias stood up from his chair. He turned to face Clint, and then he did something that the great Clint Eastwood, the man of granite, the icon of American strength, the cowboy who stared down 1,000 enemies on 1,000 screens and never flinched, was not prepared for. Tobias hugged him. Not a polite hug, not a handshake that turned into a shoulder pat, not the careful, measured embrace of two men who respect each other but keep a safe distance. A real hug, full, desperate, the kind of hug that uses every muscle in the body, the kind a son gives a father, the kind a brother gives a brother. The kind that says, without a single word, I was drowning, and you pulled me out, and I will never, as long as I live, forget what you did for me in the dark. Clint hugged him back. He wrapped his arms around Tobias and held on, tight. His chin rested on Tobias' shoulder, his eyes closed. And for a few seconds, 5, maybe 10, maybe a lifetime, the two men just stood there, holding each other up. The way they had been holding each other up, in different ways, for 22 years. The room fell apart. Margot buried her face in Pierce's shoulder. Kester pulled off his glasses and pressed his thumb and finger into his eyes. Darnell stood with his hands at his sides, tears rolling freely down his weathered face, making no move to stop them. Lenora held her own hands and rocked gently in her chair, whispering something that nobody could hear, but that sounded, if you leaned close enough, like a prayer. And Sable Greer, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, mascara ruined, clipboard forgotten somewhere on a counter, watching two men hold each other in the candlelight. She smiled. Through the tears, through the mess, through the long, impossible night that had started with a slammed door and a gravel driveway and a chef's coat thrown on a passenger seat. She smiled. Because this was why she had driven 90 miles an hour through the fog. This was why she had knocked on a truck window in a dark parking lot. This was what she had known, not in her head, but in her chest, was waiting at the end of the road. This right here. He fixed it first. He told him later. That's what love looks like. It was after 1 in the morning when the guests began to leave. They left slowly. The way people leave a place they don't want to forget. Handshakes that lasted too long, hugs that said more than goodbyes, voices calling out into the cool night air as car doors opened and engines turned over and headlights swung across the gravel driveway one last time. Thank you, Clint. Good night. That was the most beautiful evening of my life. Darnell was the last to go. He stood on the porch with his empty wine bottle tucked under his arm. The bottle he had brought, now drained, the way all good bottles should be. He looked at Clint for a long time. Two old men on a porch. 50 years between them. The kind of friendship that doesn't need words anymore, because the words have all been said, and what's left is just the standing. Just the being there. You did good tonight, Darnell said. I cooked dinner, Clint said. Darnell shook his head. No, you did a whole lot more than that. He turned and walked down the path. Slow, steady. His boots crunching on the gravel until the sound faded and his taillights disappeared around the bend in the road. The house was quiet. Sable had gone to bed. Fenwick and Waverly had left hours ago. The dining room was dark. The candles had burned down to nothing. Just small pools of white wax hardened on the tablecloth like frozen tears. The 23 chairs were pushed back from the table at careless angles, the way chairs look after something real has happened in a room. Tobias walked into the kitchen. Nobody asked him to. Nobody told him to go there. But his feet carried him the way they always had. The way they had every morning at 4:30 for 22 years. Through the doorway, past the pantry, to the center island, to his spot, where the tile was worn smooth and the light from the window above the sink fell in a pale rectangle on the counter. He stood there. He ran his hand along the marble, cool, smooth, familiar as his own skin. He opened the refrigerator, and there, on the middle shelf, wrapped in foil with a small note taped to the top, was a plate of food. The note was in Clint's handwriting. 4 words. You didn't eat tonight. See, Tobias held the plate in both hands. He stared at the note. 4 words. The simplest words in the world. and they hit him harder than the letter had, harder than the money, harder than the deed to the cottage, because this was the language they spoke, not dollars, not documents, not grand gestures announced at candlelit tables in front of 22 witnesses. Food. A plate of food, wrapped in foil, left in the refrigerator for a man who forgot to eat. That was the language. That had always been the language. He unwrapped the plate. On it, a thick slice of lamb, with the herb crust still golden and fragrant. A scoop of risotto, creamy and flecked with parsley. Roasted vegetables, squash, onions, blistered tomatoes, piled together like a small, warm garden. A piece of bread, torn by hand, its edges rough and honest. And tucked in the corner, a small glass dish of panna cotta with honey and crushed pistachios, and that faint warmth underneath. Mexican chocolate. Rosalita's secret. His mother's fingerprint, still here, still present, still part of everything he made and everything that was made for him. He put the plate in the oven to warm. He leaned against the counter. He waited. The kitchen was quiet. Through the walls, the last sounds of the night faded. The front door closing, the lock clicking. Footsteps in the hallway, slow, tired footsteps that he would know anywhere. The oven beeped. Tobiah pulled out the plate. He carried it to the small table in the corner of the kitchen. The table where he had eaten every meal for 22 years. The table that looked out over the herb garden and, beyond it, past the cliffs, the ocean. He sat down. He picked up a fork, and just as the first bite reached his mouth, he saw Clint standing in the doorway. The apron was gone. The flannel shirt was back, buttoned at the cuffs, the way it had been at 5 o'clock, when this whole night began. He looked exhausted. He looked ancient. He looked like a man who had emptied himself completely and was running on nothing but the fumes of something he believed in. He leaned against the doorframe. He crossed his arms. He watched Tobiah eat. "How's the lamb?" he asked. "Perfect," Tobiah said. "I learned from the best." Tobiah smiled. It was the first real smile he had managed in 3 weeks. It didn't come from his mouth. It came from somewhere deeper, from the place where his mother's songs were stored, where the memory of Paloma's first steps lived, where every good thing he had ever known, every sunrise seen from this kitchen window, every meal shared at this small table, every morning he had woken up in the cottage behind this house and felt, for one more day, that he was home, was kept safe. "Clint," he said. "Yeah, thank you. But not for the money, not for the surgery, not for the cottage." Clint tilted his head slightly. "Then for what?" "For cooking tonight." Clint was quiet. He uncrossed his arms. He put his hands in his pockets. "Why that?" he asked. "Because my mother used to say that when someone cooks for you, they are telling you something. They are saying, 'I see you. I know you are tired. I know the world is heavy. Sit down. Let me carry it for a little while." Tobiah looked at the plate, at the lamb, at the bread torn by hands that had directed movies and won awards and built a life that the whole world admired. Hands that tonight had done something far greater than any of that. "That's what you said tonight, Clint. To me, in front of everyone. You said, 'Sit down, let me carry it.'" Clint stood in the doorway for a long moment. His jaw worked. His throat moved. The stone had cracked wide open hours ago, and there was nothing left to hold back the water. He walked over and sat down across from Tobiah at the small table. 2 men, 1 table. The ocean outside the window, black and vast and patient. "Your daughter is going to be fine," Clint said. "I know. She's going to be a great doctor. I know. And you're going to be there to see it. Every step. Every graduation. Every patient she heals. You're going to be standing right there." "I know," Tobiah said. And this time, for the first time in 3 weeks, he believed it. 22 years, Tobiah said. 22 years, Clint repeated. "What do the next 22 look like?" Clint leaned back in his chair. He looked out the window, at the dark ocean, at the same view he had watched for decades, the same cliffs, the same salt air, the same sound of waves that never stopped coming, no matter what happened inside this house or inside the hearts of the men who lived here. "Same as the first," he said. "You cook, I show up, we take care of each other." "Deal," Tobiah said. He took another bite of lamb. Clint watched him eat, and for a moment, just a small, still moment, in the middle of a night that had held more truth than most people experience in a lifetime, everything was exactly as it should be. Two brothers, one kitchen, a plate of food between them. Outside, the waves broke against the cliffs of Carmel by the sea, the same waves that had broken there for 10,000 years before either of them was born, the same waves that would break there long after both of them were gone. But tonight, in this kitchen, in this small circle of warmth and light, time didn't matter. Age didn't matter. Money didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was this: a man was hungry, and someone who loved him had left a plate in the refrigerator. 4 words on a piece of tape. You didn't eat tonight. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole story, really, if you boiled it down to its bones. Not the money, not the surgery, not the letter or the envelope or the empty chair. Just one person, paying attention to another person, and doing something about it. The kitchen light stayed on. It always did. This story was never about a chef who quit before dinner. It was about a man who showed up every morning for 22 years, and another man who noticed. It was about a plate of food that meant stay, and a white envelope that meant you're not alone. It was about the people who carry everyone else, and the moment someone finally carries them. If you know a Tobiah, tell them, tonight, don't wait 17 days. Some plates can't wait. And that's the thing about kindness. It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to cost $387,000. Sometimes it's just a plate of food left in the refrigerator for someone who forgot to eat. Sometimes it's showing up. Sometimes it's paying attention. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story can travel. And if this video made you feel something, if it made your chest tight or your eyes sting, or it made you think about someone in your life who carries everyone else and never asks for help, hit that like button. That one little tap helps this story reach someone who might need to hear it today. If you're not subscribed yet, join this family. We tell stories that remind people what matters. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss one. And if you want another story that will stay with you for days, click on the video on your screen right now. Trust me on this one. You're not ready for it. I'll see you there.